Hi there and welcome back to this webinar series on Introduction to Excel for Pharmacists. This is webinar 4 and today we're going to be looking at formatting plots and developing them into figures that we can put into a piece of work. So here we're faced with the data set from the last session and we've got patient ID and patient's name and their sex and age and then the information to calculate their BMI and whether they are a smoker or not. And before the session, I've created a scatter plot here of weight versus BMI. What we're looking for here is we're looking for trends in that data set to see whether indeed there is any overlap between, are there any correlation between an increase in patient weight and whether they have a high BMI or not. I've got to explain that because the figure we see on the right-hand side of the screen here doesn't have any axis labels yet, and so the data is very difficult to understand. So for the untrained eye, anyone coming in looking at your data, they're going to have absolutely no idea what the figure represents. So we're going to go ahead and add some axis labels first. So by clicking on the chart itself, we bring up this chart design tab in the top left-hand menu. So by clicking on that, we will bring up this menu item here, which allows us to change and edit the formatting in our figure. So by clicking Add Chart Elements, we get this drop-down menu, and we see this title here called Axis Menus. And we want to add a primary horizontal and vertical title, so we can click Axis Titles here and add an axis title on both of those. So on the x-axis, in this case, we have weight plotted. And it's important in this case, in all cases, that we add the units as well, so that anyone looking at our data can understand exactly what we're trying to say. And same for the y-axis. In this case, we have BMI, which obviously, as you know, doesn't require a unit in this case. So we have our data set here, and at the moment it just looks like a cluster of points. It's very difficult to see whether there's a correlation here or not. We might be able to see a slight trend, but it's quite difficult to quantify. So we want to be adding ourselves a trend line in here. And we can do that in a few different ways. We can either do that by clicking the Add Chart Elements button again, scrolling down to trend line, and then we can select the kind of trend line we want to add. Or we can click on our data set, and you'll see elements of the data set being highlighted. Right click and click Add Trend Line. And there we bring up this menu in the right-hand side that allows us to select which kind of trend line we'd like to add. In this case, we'd like to add a linear trend line. As we can see from the figure on the side, from the figure now, we can see a very slight positive correlation. But how do we know that's positive, and how is our reader going to know that's positive? Well, in which case we can do that by looking and displaying our R-squared value, which is 0.27 in this case. That's a positive value, so we're looking at a positive correlation. And then we can also display at this point by clicking the Display Equation on Chart button. In the right-hand menu, we can click to add our equation. Pop that somewhere where it's nice and easy to see. And that's that there. So we also notice that in this case, our data is very heavily grouped above 50 kilograms in weight. So although our BMI is nicely distributed over the right-hand side of the figure, there's an awful lot of white space in the left-hand side of the figure. In some cases, our data set mandates us to, or forces us to anchor our data to 0. In this case, our data set is very heavily orientated above 50 kilograms in weight. So we may well want to trim our axes down in order to make this into a figure that fits nicely into our work and doesn't have this large area of white space. And we can do that in a couple of different ways again. But the easiest way is to click on the axis you would like to modify, right click, scroll down to the Format Axis tab, and we bring up this menu in the right hand side of the screen. And from this we can see that our minimum is anchored at 0, and our maximum is up at 100, and our data set fits somewhere between that. Now we know from looking at the data here that our minimum weight, minimum mass for any of the patients in the study is 50 kilograms. So we're going to anchor our axis at 40. Give ourselves a nice bit of space, and we'll now see our data is nicely distributed over the center of the figure. So we've now got labeled axis, we've got a title on top, and we've got our R² value and equation. In this case, this is all we need to do to this chart, but we could go further at this point. Depending on our data set, we could also add, by clicking the Add Chart Elements tab again, we can add extra grid lines to allow our reader to more easily see between the points of the data set if our data set is very close. We can also add error bars to see any significance within our data. And we can also add individual data labels. But in this case, because it's a scatter graph, if we add data labels, it will become too confused. Thank you very much for listening, and we're looking forward to seeing you in webinar 5.